high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officers, high officials, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it can be changed, not be changed at all. An official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied. That decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man, Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered Daniel to be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and this rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered throughout the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Wow. Thank you, Christine. Wonderful reading. Daniel chapter 6. When I was young, with my brother and my sister who's here, Dad used to take us for rides, family outings. And in Christchurch, we used to go to this place called the Port Hills. And Dad would take us up, and we had this rickety old Morris Oxford, and it was slow, but we would wind up, and we used to love it, I think I was probably around 6 years old, and my brother not much older, and we used to do this on one particular Sunday as we were going for this family drive. We were in a narrow part of the road going up into the Port Hills, and we were going slow. And behind us were a whole bunch of, I guess, what we would call bogans. Is that a familiar term here if you're a Westie? Bogans, car enthusiasts, boy racers, except we didn't have such things back then, but they were like that. And their cars were faster than ours, and of course, they were getting impatient, and there was a lot of tooting and hooting. And of course, they started playing with us, and they'd come up beside us, and these were guys in leather jackets, and they looked scary. They had tattoos, and they were racing up beside us and shaking their fist at us and calling us all sorts of terrible names. And we were terrified. I remember me and my brother started crying. And we couldn't believe what was happening. We thought we were in great danger. It appeared that way to us. Dad said to us, he says, "Boys, don't worry." And he just calmly stopped the car in the middle of the road so that nobody could get past. Now, if you've seen my dad, he's not a big guy. He only comes up to about here. And we were like, "What are you going to do, Dad?" He's like, "Don't worry." And he turns to my mum and he says to my mum, "Lock the doors." Just calm like that. And he hops out, walks around to the boot, opens it up, and we turn around looking what he's doing. He pulls out the wheel brace, shuts the boot, calmly turns around and walks to the first car. These people had all jumped out. When Dad stopped, everyone had jumped out. And there was a lot of them. Well, Dad just walked to the first car. They all jumped back in the car. Dad walked to the second car. They all jumped back. Can you imagine it? Little short guy. He's walking down the line of cars, and they all jumped back in. Then he came back, put the wheel brace back in the boot, and off we went, and we never bothered again. From that day on, I had full assurance that my dad was able to rescue us from any situation. My dad was a hero. And from that day onward, it didn't matter what we came up against. If my dad was there, we were okay. This is what Daniel 6 is about. Daniel 6 is about knowing that with God, everything is okay. That with God, He delivers. But He doesn't deliver for the purpose of preservation on this earthly kingdom. Can I say that again? God never delivers for the purpose of preservation on this earthly kingdom. He always delivers for the purpose of new creation in His everlasting kingdom. You understand? And when we understand that this is the type of God we serve, and we understand some principles that apply in the kingdom of God, His everlasting kingdom, then we can rest assured that God delivers. You've heard the story and you know the story. But you see, the Bible isn't just a bunch of cool stories that cause us to think, oh yeah, if God did that for Daniel, then he'll do it for me. It's not just that. I mean, you can use it like that, and that can give you encouragement, and that's great, but the Bible is more than that. The Bible is like 66 books, written by 40 different authors over thousands of years, and everything in it matches, and it's unbelievable. A few months ago, we did a study in our teen gathering in the back there with 360, and we discovered some amazing things about the Bible, that it's a messaging system. And I'd like to just show you a quick demonstration of this. Proverbs 25 verse 2 says this: "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but it is the honor of kings to search out a matter." You know, in the 16th century, the Jewish people were certain that there were things about the Bible and the way that it was written, and especially the Old Testament, and particularly the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There were things about that they hadn't yet discovered. So a couple of rabbis spent years poring over the Torah to see if there was a pattern. The secrets of the Torah, what they discovered, are revealed in the skipping of letters. Interesting concept. So these two rabbis spent centuries poring over Torah to see if there was any message in these books. Now, I don't know what you think of this sort of stuff, and I'm not trying to be all woo, but what I want to show you is something interesting, and if we can just go to the next slide. Here's what they found. In the book of Genesis, just by chance, that every 49th letter in the book of Genesis had one letter that made up the word Torah. And if you had the time to count, you would see it. There's one letter, every 49th letter, that is part of the word Torah. Well, that's a pretty cool coincidence. Until we go to the next slide, and we find that when they studied Exodus, exactly the same thing. Now, these books are not short books. They're long books. Hey, you might be able to do it with a book like Jude, which is like 1 or 2 chapters, but long books like Exodus, I don't know, So that's Exodus. They go to Leviticus, and they find nothing. So they think, oh well, it was a coincidence. They go to Numbers, and they do the same thing. And if we can go to the next slide, what they find is the same thing every 49 letters. By the way, 49 is the square root of 7. That's kind of funny, isn't it? And if you know anything about the year of Jubilee, that's kind of funny. Anyway, it's coincidence. Numbers, that every 49th letter is a letter that spells Torah, except now it's backwards. What? So they go to Deuteronomy, and this is what they find. Exactly the same thing, that every 49th letter contains a letter of the word Torah, and it's backwards. So now this is what we have. If we can go to the next slide. We have Genesis says Torah. We have Exodus that says Torah. There's nothing in Leviticus. We have Numbers that says Torah backwards, and we have Deuteronomy that says Torah backwards. Aren't you itching to know what it says in Leviticus? There's got to be something, doesn't there? They go to Leviticus, and this is what they find. It's not intervals of 49. It's intervals of 7. You know, Leviticus is one of the most technical books in the Bible, but it's not 49. It's every interval of 7. And what they find in every interval of 7, all the way through the most technical book in the Bible, Leviticus, they find these letters, Yah, Ha, Va, Ha. Yah, Ha, Va, Ha. In English, we say Jehovah. The Jewish people won't say that because it's too holy. They just go, Yah, Ha, Va, Ha. They don't want to say the word. If you make up a word for God, then you make him too common. So they go, Yah, Ha, Va, Ha. The sound of breathing. Yahweh, Jehovah. So here's what we have. Next slide, please. The Torah always points to Yahweh. The Bible is more than just a bunch of stories. It's more than just stuff to make you feel good. There are messages in there that are divinely inspired. And if we would read it and study it, we would find them over time. If we can just go to the next slide. There's another literary technique that I'd like to introduce you to, because this is important for Daniel chapter 6. This technique is called chiasmos, and I want to read you a definition of chiasmos. It's this. In rhetoric, chiasmos is the figure of speech in which two or more clauses are related to each other through a reversal of structures in order to make a larger point. Understand? That is, the clauses display inverted parallelism. Being the simple man that I am, I have to find out easier ways to understand these things. So I found a technique that means the same thing, but that I can understand a lot better. And this idea, or this theory, has come from a group of deeply theological adherents from Sweden who were prominent thought provokers from 1972 through to 1982, and here's a picture of them. There they are. I call this the ABBA structure. And just so you know how this literary structure works, the ABBA structure works like this. You see, in English, in our Western Greek thought, when we want to find an answer, we use logic. We go A plus B equals C. So the answer is C. It's a linear thinking. But in Hebrew thought and in Middle Eastern thought, they don't use that structure. They use this structure, which I call the ABBA structure. And just as an example, this is how it might work. Next slide, please. Here's a Bible text. We have escaped as a bird, this is Psalms 124:7, from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken and we have escaped. If we apply the highly technical ABBA structure to this is what we see. Next slide. A, we have escaped as a bird. B, from the snare of the fowlers. B, the snare is broken. And A, and we have escaped. Do you see how A matches A? A says we have escaped as a bird, and then A says and we have escaped, saying the same thing. It's repeating. And B matches B, from the snare of the fowlers, the snare is broken. It's about the snare. So the central point or the central theme or the central thought in this type of literary structure is B, supported by the A's. Just so we can get a deeper appreciation for the ABBA theory, here's a much longer text, and I'd like to display how this one works. If we can have the next slide, please. This is from Isaiah 60, verse 1 to 3, and it says this, Arise, shine, for thy light is come, and the glory of Yahweh upon thee is risen. For behold, dimness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the peoples. But upon thee will arise Yahweh, and his glory shall upon thee be seen, and nations shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. Now, when you can look at the A's, and you look at the B's, and you look at the C's, and you look at the D's, what do you see? A, arise, matches with the A at the end of thy rising. B, shine, matches with B and the kings to the brightness. C, for thy light is come. And C, and nations shall come to thy light. You understand? Chiasmos. It's called a chiastic structure. This didn't just work. The writers didn't just use this literary technique for single verses, but they used it for whole books. And did you know that you can go to the Bible and you can take whole passages and find these chiastic structures? And for me, people go, yeah, that's really clever. I think after a while when you look at and you notice it, you see that there's some supernatural working here because it's complex, but the messages are very simple. And God tries to get messages through to us in incredibly complex ways. Daniel chapter 6 is part of a chiasm. You know, the first, many theologians say that Daniel is broken into two bits. There's Daniel verse 2 to 7 is the first bit, and then the rest is the second bit. And so when you look at Daniel 2 to 7, there's a chiasm in there as well. And can we just show this? Daniel 2 is the rise and fall of nations, matching Daniel 7, which is the rise and fall of nations. Daniel 3 is the deliverance of Daniel and his friends. And what we're going to talk about this morning is Daniel 6, which is the deliverance of Daniel. Daniel 4 is the fall and rise of Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel 5 is the fall of Belshazzar. So the central theme is that earthly kingdoms don't last, and those themes are supported by all these events that happen. So when we look at Daniel 6, I think it's really important that we draw the comparisons between Daniel 6 and Daniel 3, because there's a message there for us. Can we just go to the next slide, please? There's a thematic link. Remember, Daniel's friends had a quick rise to prominence. It didn't take long, and they were recognized very quickly as capable and able young men to help govern Nebuchadnezzar's earthly kingdom. We notice in Daniel chapter 6, after the fall of Babylon, and Darius the Mede walks into Babylon, he's commanding Cyrus's army. Cyrus was the real leader. Darius the Mede was commanding his army for him. Darius the Mede marches in. Belshazzar is dead. Which ruler was he? Can you remember from last week? He was the second ruler in the kingdom because his father Nabonidus had been exiled. Nabonidus was the true ruler of Babylon. His son Belshazzar was sitting in Babylon running it for him. Nabonidus was exiled. Belshazzar died that night. What ruler was Daniel made in the kingdom? Because he could interpret the writing on the wall. He was made number 3. So who was standing at the gate, do you think, to welcome the new conquerors? Belshazzar's gone. Nabonidus exiled. It's Daniel. There's an amazing prophecy in the book of Isaiah about Cyrus, 150 years before Cyrus was even born, that foretells and uses the name Cyrus, that he would march into Babylon and overthrow it. 150 years before Cyrus was even born. A prophecy in Isaiah. Wow. I imagine, and some Christian tradition says that the thing that Daniel had in his hand as Darius marched in is, what do you think? This prophecy of Isaiah, stating the name of Cyrus, that he would be ruler. That would get him a bit of kudos, don't you think? Don't you think? And here he is. And so, a very quick rise to prominence, set apart immediately. We find in Daniel chapter 3 that there is a setting up of the kingdom with the 3 Hebrews, the setting up of the image. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, but he wants his earthly kingdom to last forever. And we see the setting up of a kingdom. We also see the setting up of a kingdom in chapter 6, where Darius puts in place 120 satraps and 3 presidents to run those 120. And Daniel's one of them. So also in chapter 6 is a king setting up his earthly kingdom. We find in chapter 3 that God's favor shone on those boys. And we find also in chapter 6 that God's favor shone on Daniel. That he set himself apart, that he excelled higher than all the rest. We find in chapter 3 religious intolerance. Anti-Semitism is a scourge where people hate with a passion Jewish people. It's called anti-Semitism. We experience it, but for us it's called xenophobia, where we despise people from other countries. We see that xenophobia and anti-Semitism is unpacked in both chapter 3 and chapter 6. The Chaldeans, can you imagine, in chapter 3, come up to King Nebuchadnezzar and say, "O king, live forever." Everyone else is bowing down, but there are these Jewish people who won't bow down. As a matter of fact, can you imagine, they're really stoking it up. As a matter of fact, they never bow down. As a matter of fact, they disregard you. They've been doing it the whole time. We told you from the beginning, watch out for these Jewish people. By the time they had finished with Nebuchadnezzar, he was so mad. He was so angry by the time these Chaldeans had stirred up anti-Semitism, that by the time those boys got to him, boy, he was done. We see it again in Daniel. "O king, live forever." This is Darius this time. "Didn't you decree that the only one that should be worshipped for 30 days is you?" There's this guy, Daniel. He's a Jewish person. He's despising. He's always despising. Why you put him in that position, I'll never know. Except Darius, as opposed to Nebuchadnezzar, saw the plot, and he was beside himself about it. Persecution in chapter 3 and persecution in chapter 6. And then, of course, deliverance. What can we learn from Daniel chapter 6 about Daniel when he's in his time of despair? We notice in verse 10 that he recognizes this desperate situation. The text says that as soon as he hears that this law has been passed, he goes home and he prays. See, Daniel was privy to this the whole time. It wasn't a surprise. He knew that these politicians were going around behind his back trying to get this law passed. He was hoping that it wouldn't be passed for him and his people, but it did get passed. And as soon as he heard it, he went home and he prayed. He fell on his knees and he made supplications to God. However, it's not this situation that brings him to his knees, because we read in verse 10, it says this, I love how it states it, as was his usual practice. As was his usual practice, Daniel went home to pray to the everlasting God. Prayer is not a desperate last resort when death comes knocking. Prayer should be an integral part of life. For Daniel, prayer was associated with a place as well, making it easier for him to leave the cares of the world and go to his place of prayer. We should integrate prayer into the rhythm of our lives. I find this hard to do because I'm kind of a random guy. I kind of pray whenever, wherever. And it's often, but it's often not planned. I pray in my car when the Spirit moves. I don't shut my eyes when I do that, by the way. Don't do that. I pray in my car when the Spirit moves. I pray when I'm walking. But I'm learning from Daniel to set time aside and make it the rhythm, part of the rhythm of my life. Rhythm of life goes like this: 6 o'clock, wake up. 6:15, pray. 6:30, have breakfast. 7 o'clock, wake up the kids. 8 o'clock, go to work. 12 o'clock's lunchtime. 12:30, pray. See, part of the rhythm of life. 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, home, tea. 8 o'clock, pray. Just part of the rhythm of life. And this is what Daniel did. True prayer is bathed in these two elements, recognizing one's own void. Because when you read Daniel's prayer in chapter 6, the first thing he acknowledges is his desperate situation and acknowledging that everything comes from God. Of course, there's deliverance in both chapters. And I love this. Darius calls down to Daniel. He says, Daniel, servant of the living God. Daniel's reply is this: O king, live forever. See, there's a message there. Darius, O Daniel, servant of the living God. The reply, O king, live forever. In other words, the only reason you live, O king, is because I serve a God who lives forever. And you need to understand that, Darius. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. Daniel doesn't mention his outstanding courage. He doesn't mention his incredible discipline in prayer. He simply mentions, my God, whom I serve, was able to shut the lions' mouths. Darius makes a proclamation. And the proclamation is very interesting. You see, at the beginning of this chapter, the proclamation was that everyone should worship him, Darius, an earthly king. By the end of this chapter, the proclamation is that everyone should worship the God of Daniel, the everlasting God, who's ruler of the everlasting kingdom. Only God's kingdom will last forever. And Darius, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, gets it. God rescues and he saves. It's really interesting, the resurrection themes in the book of Daniel, I find. I think of Daniel, who was unjustly accused. I think of Jesus, who was also unjustly accused. I think of Daniel, whom Darius tried to defend, whom Darius spent hours just trying to rack his brains over how we could let this innocent man not have to feel the brunt of the law of the Medes and Persians. I think of Pilate, who did the same for Jesus, who agonized long and hard of how he could let Jesus go free. I think of Daniel, who went down into a pit. You know, the text says that they rolled a stone over that den and they sealed it with a seal. I think of Jesus, who also went into a pit and they rolled a stone over his grave and they sealed it. I think of resurrection and Daniel being lifted from that pit. And I think of Jesus and his resurrection and being lifted from that pit. But as I was reading this passage and how God shut the mouths of the lions, it regenerated a tough question for me. And I don't know if I've fully come to terms with it, but as I've read a little more, I think the way God is starts to make sense to me. If we can go to the next slide. Here's another picture of a lion. It's a famous picture. We've all seen the picture of Daniel in the lion's den standing majestically while the lion's looking at him. But we all know, I think, what this picture represents. Persecution of followers of Jesus Christ, for whom the angels did not shut the lions' mouths. Do you struggle with this? Do you struggle with trying to work out how is it that we read a story like Daniel and it gives us so much courage and so much encouragement, and we get to thinking that if he did it for Daniel, he'll do it for me, and then he doesn't do it? Have you lost loved ones? After reading stories of resurrection and healing, and it's a huge question, and I'm not even going to suggest that I can answer it. But here's something that I would like to read to you this morning. And I had another reread of Hebrews chapter 11 while I was pondering this question. And it starts like this, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but Hebrews 11 starts like this. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. And then it goes on in Hebrews 11, and it's like a hall of fame of all these faithful people whom God delivered, which is really cool, until you get to verse 32. And I'm going to read from verse 32. It's on page 733 if you want to follow. How much more do I need to say, says the writer of Hebrews. It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, a reference to Daniel, I think. They quenched the flames of the fire, maybe a reference to his three friends. And they escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death. I get it, because this is the faith chapter. But then the mood changes. It says this. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. Did you hear that? But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning, and others were killed with a sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith. Yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better. And I say it again. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us who are still living. God had something better. Here's the principle that I think I'm starting to see. Deliverance in the earthly kingdom deliverance is about preservation, isn't it? Preservation of my life here now. Preservation of my status. Preservation of my family. Preservation of my name. Darius was king over that type of principle. Nebuchadnezzar was king over that type of principle of preservation. God's kingdom that lasts forever runs by a different principle. It's not the principle of preservation, which is why God delivers. It's the principle of restoration. Not preservation, but restoration. Making all things new. That's why God delivers in his kingdom. So he saves Daniel to give us confidence that he can save. If he never saved anyone, we'd never know that he can save. But he saves Daniel so that all us who follow have confidence that he can save. I have complete confidence in my dad that he can look after us all the way through my childhood. It's the same type of principle. Restoration, not preservation. As I look at this picture and I think of those Christians, I wonder what story they were recounting. I kind of reckon that when they saw those lions, the story that brought them hope and courage was the story of Daniel in the lion's den. You know, Hebrews talks about Daniel in the lion's den in the light of resurrection. Not in the light of preservation of life, but in the light of resurrection to new life. In the light of resurrection to a new and restored creation. I'm not sure how you sit with this, and I'm not sure how you make this work for you in your mind, God's principles. But here's the thing. God understands. God can save, and he can deliver, and he will, and he has. And he knows the den that you may be in today. And maybe you have lions around you. Maybe they're financial lions. Maybe they're lions of poor health. Maybe there's a lion of peer pressure in your den. Maybe there's lions of loneliness and despair and feeling inadequate. There's a passage in Daniel chapter 6 when read in the Hebrew intimates very strongly the way that Daniel prayed. And it says that when he prayed with his hands open like this. Literally. Because true prayer is always bathed in surrender. True prayer is always bathed in knowing how void you are of any ability to save yourself from your den. And as I think about Daniel praying and I think about how he prayed, I'm going to invite you in a minute to maybe do the same. Just where you're sitting, as Richard and Leah share a message and song with us, that you also turn your hands over and that you pray and that you ask God and you submit and you admit that there's nothing in you, in your earthly kingdom ability to bring about the restoration that God talks about. God has a message for you this morning. Trust him. Trust him. This is the message of Daniel chapter 6. One of the most difficult things to do is to trust God in the midst of the storm. Everyone that you thought you could count on has walked away. The family that you thought was strong has disintegrated. A loved one passes on, and we've experienced a bit of that here in this church. And sometimes it seems like everybody that you thought you could trust has walked away. And sometimes it even feels that God himself has walked away. Daniel prays for deliverance in his room, it appears that God isn't answering. Jesus prays to God, his Father, for deliverance in Gethsemane, and it appears he's not listening. It even appears he's walked away. But in spite of all that, God invites us to turn your hands over and to trust in him. I invite you to do that this morning.